My name is Sidney Saint-Hilaire, and the title of my capstone is Misdiagnosis, Race-Conscious Approaches to Medical Education. To ground this conversation, I'd like to start by talking about this graph. In a study conducted by the CDC, it was found that pregnant Black individuals are more likely to experience infant death, maternal death, preterm birth, and low birth weight. This is a trend that is resistant to time and place as shown by the data. Unfortunately, the disparities don't stop here. Similar ratios of race-aligned health disparities are present in nearly every conceivable domain. Rates of cancer survival, chronic illnesses like hypertension and diabetes, and diseases like asthma and lead poisoning are all appear to be more severe in Black individuals as well as Native and Indigenous populations. Part of why statistics such as these can be so jarring is that while people who are perceived as Black have similar outcomes in terms of health to each other, they often share more genetic information in common with individuals from other races. In this way, it is almost as if racism and its manifestations force biological difference into existence, though we know that the true answer has much more to do with structural issues like environment, access to healthcare, and political and economic disenfranchisement. Considerations about racial disparities that have these kinds of considerations at the forefront are only just beginning to happen in mainstream medical education circles. More often than not, cultural competence has been proposed as the individual level answer to treating health disparities. Cultural competence is a pedagogical approach to medicine and healthcare that emphasizes the use of a patient's ethnic, racial, linguistic, and religious backgrounds in diagnosis and health communication. The development of this paradigm was a momentous step towards equity in health and treatment. It prompted the medical field to recognize a patient's culture as relevant to perspectives on health and patient-doctor relationships. And yet, for all the good that it has done for medicine, cultural competence is far from a sufficient framework for conceptualizing health disparities. There are a few key flaws present in culturally competent framework that threaten to impede more substantive action to solve the issue of race and health. The faults of cultural competence are made plainer when they are situated in a history of race and health. Culture and ethnicity are conflated with race due to the medical field's history of masking the reality of human difference under pseudoscientific taxonomy. Cultural competency is seen as a quantifiable metric because of medicine's historical predisposition towards quantifiable and observable information. Moreover, cultural competence training is seen as a solve not only for biases that exist between doctors and patients, but for systemic level discrimination because of the hyper-focus on the body that was already present in medicine and reiterated by cultural competency's person-focused pedagogies. Taking these considerations into account, it becomes clear that cultural competence, while useful in limited ways, is therefore an insufficient solution to racial disparities in health and medical practice. Treating the stubborn illness of racism requires further work. Such necessary developments in the field of health disparity education are concepts known as critical health studies, cultural humility, and structural competency. Drawing from frameworks from critical race theory, critical health studies is a powerful tool of internal analysis, reflection, and critique. Primarily, CHS teaches physicians how to read the world, which was Paulo Freire's description of recognizing differences in power, privilege, and inequity that are present in interpersonal and structural dynamics alike. Like a stethoscope, CHS is designed to make apparent the otherwise invisible pedagogies and assumptions of the classroom, the hospital, and other institutions that are symbolic of mainstream medical culture. Cultural humility retains the same pathos as cultural competence, but it differentiates itself from the mainstream paradigm by refusing to equate culture to other bodies of knowledge in the medical field. It does so out of a recognition of the sheer multiplicity of experience that culture can entail. One of the first admissions of cultural humility is that it is impossible to be adequately knowledgeable about other cultures that are not your own. Lastly, structural competency manages to center the real yet fabricated natures of race and culture and health through framing and understanding of disparities in healthcare in a discussion about structural influences. Structural competency also calls upon physicians to recognize themselves and their positions within that structure. The most memorable but apocryphal excerpt from the Hippocratic Oath is, above all, do no harm. It is a promise to use the privilege and power of doctorship only to a patient's benefit. As we grow as a society in our recognition of the long arms of racism and discrimination, so too must physicians grow in their appreciation of the harms they can and should heal. Cultural humility, critical health studies, and structural competence represent essential extensions of cultural competence that build upon its strongest attributes while not falling victim to the same biases and assumptions that have hindered it thus far in the fight against racism in health. These are
Hi, my name is Jane Buckley, and for my capstone, which is called Reimagining Consent Education in the United States, I wrote an original children's book that aims to help dismantle rape culture from a young age. So, the problem that my capstone addresses, as you might have guessed, is rape culture, which feminist scholars define as a culture in which sexual violence is perpetuated and sustained by systems of power. And really, what this refers to is all of the subtle and not so subtle, all of the day to day and systemized ways that sexual violence is normalized for all of us throughout our lifetimes. Um, and I really have been passionate about addressing this issue throughout college in my job as a communication and consent educator through the Yale College Dean's Office. And this job has been really fulfilling, but has also made me realize that many students, including myself, come into college with no prior knowledge of consent or what it means. And that really made me start to ask questions about how early should and can consent education be started, and what does that look like? And so I was looking specifically at two bodies of research, feminist literature on rape culture and literature on child development. And while neither body of research really acknowledged the other as much as I thought they should have, when you put the two in conversation, there's this really significant finding that attitudes about rape culture can form and thus should be addressed as early as kindergarten. And so while creating consent education programming that starts in kindergarten, is a tempting thought, our American sex education system really does not allow for that. It's unregulated. It promotes programs that can actually perpetuate some aspects of rape culture. And so I had to look elsewhere to think of an intervention that could provide consent education to kindergartners in a developmentally appropriate way, but not in a way that would run into problems in the classroom. And so my answer was to write a children's book. I saw the potential for a storyline that acknowledged how children are developing ideas about rape culture. And my hope was that the final product could be something that was engaging and hopeful and fun, rather than kind of sobering and pessimistic as many consent education programs are for older students. And so when thinking through ideas of what to put in the story, I kept coming back to the idea of fairy tales, and specifically of Sleeping Beauty. These stories are deeply ingrained in our culture as kind of the height of romance, and this message is sent to kids at such a young age. And I wanted to acknowledge the fact that these stories aren't going to disappear soon, but that there are still ways that we can be addressing their problematic aspects, like when the prince kisses the princess in Sleeping Beauty without her consent. And so I really wanted my story to be able to empower children to acknowledge and respond to the things that were making them uncomfortable, thus building a toolbox that they would be able to hopefully take with them throughout their whole lives, and kind of build this culture of respect. So my book is titled Wake Up, Sleeping Beauty, and it follows the plot of an older cousin reading Sleeping Beauty to her two kindergarten-age cousins, Kent and Amy, who are modeled off my real-life cousins. And when the fairy tale reaches the part where the prince is going to kiss the princess, Kent and Amy interrupt the reading, voicing that this interaction feels uncomfortable to them. Their older cousin encourages this discussion and asks some questions, and the two kindergartners end up rewriting that part of the book, imagining many different endings in which the prince wakes up the princess in a respectful way. And the book is accompanied by a parent's guide with suggested questions to ask the young readers. And a family friend of mine very generously drew some mock illustrations for me. So here are some examples of what it might look like. And you can see on this page, there's a parent's guide asking the children what they think of why Amy asked her cousin if it was okay to sit in her lap, which already is introducing some ideas of consent and respect, and respecting people's boundaries. And then this last page of the book, I imagine having Kent and Amy talking about all of their different ideas for how the prince could have woken the princess up with bringing her hot breakfast in bed, or a dog to bark at her, or a boombox or flowers. And I intentionally had the illustrator leave some speech bubbles blank as to kind of allow the readers to feel empowered that they too could imagine some different endings, which hopefully can translate to them feeling empowered in real life to challenge the things that make them uncomfortable. Um, so, in conclusion, I think what this project really helped me to articulate was that I imagine the opposite of a rape culture being a culture of respect, and that we really need to start imagining what this culture would look like theoretically and very specifically with our youngest students, so that they might help us create a world in which respect is the thing that is deeply embedded in all aspects of our culture. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed.
My name is Miriam Cohen, and my capstone is titled Interesting, the Limits of Education for Social Change. American Studies has so many classes like these, like African American history, like inequality in America. And having grown up in a white upper middle class family, I felt like they opened my eyes to how the world really worked, giving me what I'm going to call a critical awareness of capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism. And gaining this critical awareness made me feel we could change these things. I felt that as my classmates and I went out into the world, we could fix the world because we understood it. But of course, rich white kids at Yale have been taking critical classes like these for decades. And capitalism and white supremacy continue to do violence every day. So I began to wonder if this critical awareness I had developed did anything besides make me sound smart in the classroom. If critical awareness is actually just allowing me and my white friends to maintain our privilege while releasing our guilt, thus allowing the very violence and inequality we are learning about to continue. And many scholars have made the same critique, but none have examined the actual students they are critiquing. So my project is to add to these works analysis of student voices. How do racially and economically privileged graduates articulate the impact of their own critical education? To do so, I interviewed 10 recent graduates of American Studies at Yale who identify as white. Here's what I found. When I asked why they chose American Studies, the graduates used the word interesting over and over again. And on one level, this is not so surprising. But as a reminder, here are they're interested in is racial injustice. It's histories of oppression and power connecting to oppression and power in the world today. What allows them to see these things as something interesting is whiteness, is white privilege. They see injustice as an object of analysis they have distance from and can come to know. And so unsurprisingly, when I asked how American Studies affected them, they explained how they learned to critique racism, to critique their own white privilege. When I asked how learning these critiques affected them, they then give examples of how it differentiates them from other people, rather than how it changed them from their past selves. This is part of what scholar Sarah Ahmed says, we must contest the classism of the assumption that racism is caused by ignorance, which allows racism to be seen as what the working classes, or less literate others, do. Because this kind of knowledge is highly unequally distributed, differentiating oneself through intellectual critique is inherently elitist. It reserves social justice for those who can buy a critical awareness at places like Yale. So what are they doing with this critical awareness? Here's a typical quote from Hannah. I was really interested in racial injustice through my classes at Yale. And I asked, what do you think interests you about racial injustice? She says, yeah, that's such a good question, and one that still, with the work I'm doing, I'm interning at a racial justice legal advocacy organization this summer, so I feel like I should have a good answer for my initial interest. Hannah and the other graduates are converting their critical awareness of injustice into careers in the injustice field. Their American Studies education set them up for prominent careers in the field of social justice, the way a computer science major might set them up to work in Silicon Valley. Of course, social justice careers tend to pay vastly less than Silicon Valley, yet the fact that these careers pay less actually only further reserves them for privileged white graduates who don't have to build generational wealth or support families after graduation. This is not to say that Hannah should not have chosen this job or this work. Rather, is to say that it helps her to continue to acquire social and financial capital. I want to be clear that I'm not indicting these graduates as individuals. This project is an attempt to examine the systems that allow privileged people to maintain and consolidate privilege, even as we learn to critique our own privilege. And so I want to close with some thoughts about how education can do more than reproduce white privilege. And I started by reflecting on my own actions. Instead of intellectualizing injustice, I'm wondering what a more vulnerable and honest emotional tone would be like, both in the classroom and out of it. And instead of an individualistic concern with my own career and complicity, seeking out relationships and organizations that call me to live out my values. I still believe in the value of education, of critically examining systems of injustice. But this project is not to be needlessly cynical, but rather to begin a reflection that provokes us to act in ways to bring about the world we want to see.